take the DPRK with warts and all, but understand the warts are not the only thing, you know,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that, there are actually these very stunning achievements that have a lot to offer the world. And it's really a shame that, part of the blockade and the isolation against the DPRK also means that there's a blockade in our minds, like we don't know as much as we could, right? And this is a contribution that millions of human beings have made to our collective history that, now everyone else is also being deprived of.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rania Khalek, and this is Dispatches. We don't learn much about North Korea in the US beyond it being some horrible backwards dictatorship where every person is captive to an evil regime run by a madman who has an inexplicable hatred of the US, of freedom, and of democracy, and is always on the edge of launching a nuclear missile to destroy the world. This, we're told, is the reason we have to isolate the country and occupy South Korea with thousands of US soldiers. You can say almost anything about North Korea, no matter how absurd and lacking in evidence, and it'll be taken as fact as long as it makes the country look bad. This has a purpose. It's to prevent us from getting curious about what's really happening there. Why is North Korea so closed off? What's the relevant history of that region? Why did the US go to war there in the 1950s? What were the consequences? Why is Korea split into two? And is the country really as evil as the mainstream portrays? Here to help break it all down is Ju-Hyun Park, a member of Nodutdol for Korean Community Development, an anti-imperialist organization of Koreans in the US struggling for Korean unification and national liberation. They're also the engagement editor at The Real News. But before we jump into it, this is just the first half of this episode. The second half is available for Breakthrough News members only. You can become a member at patreon.com/breakthrough news. And as always, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell so you get a notification whenever we post new content. And if you appreciate this show, you can also donate below on YouTube. Ju-Hyun, welcome. It's so good to have you on.
Thanks, Rania. It's great to be here with you.
I'm excited to have this conversation. There's so much to talk about, all things North Korea. And I'm really excited to have this conversation because I think that, oftentimes North Korea is like this country where nobody really knows anything about it except for the most outlandish claims in US
Hmm.
media. Like, I can't think of any country that is lied about as much as North Korea and that has so much, like, such little pushback. So I think it's a really good opportunity to do like almost like an intro to North Korea kind of episode here.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
well, so I think, and you obviously you do so much work around this issue with the organization you're in, and you and I have talked in the past, and you're so knowledgeable. So I guess let's start. I think like let's kind of go through history here. I think no, when I remember being in school, and I doubt much has changed. Like in grade school in the U.S., and all we ever learned about the Koreas or Korea as a whole
Hmm.
was the Korean War. And there was very
Yeah.
little we learned about it. We didn't learn anything that really happened before. And then after, all we know is that North Korea is this horrible place and we have to help them. That's all we're taught. So let's let's
Hmm.
let's go before the Korean War, before the 1950s, because I don't think a lot of people are familiar with what Korea had to deal with in terms of the sort of horrors of Japanese colonialism. So can you just kind of give a brief background to what Korea endured before like World War II and during even?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think if we want to start with Japanese colonialism, we actually kind of need to take a little bit of a detour into the 19th century. Korea had the kind of historical accident or like good luck, depending on how you look at it, of being very far away from Europe. And
Mhm.
so, while it was affected in a lot of ways, actually, by the beginnings of European colonialism 500 years ago, it escaped the fate of more direct domination that a lot of other colonies had to face going back to like the 16th century and stuff. And in Korea's case, they're so far away, and for a long time, they were not really aware of these world-changing events that are happening all over the place in terms of the development of capitalism, the expansion of imperialism. But that all began to change in the 19th century with what Lenin calls the imperialist stage of capitalism. And it's in this time that most of the world really comes under the formal domination of either European or at least capitalist countries. And Korea ends up caught between three historical processes that are happening all at once and bringing more and more of the capitalist world system to its borders. First of all, there's the Opium Wars, in which are breaking down the gates to China and extending imperialism into East Asia.
Mhm.
Secondly, after the Mexican American War, the US stretches all the way across North America and begins to expand aggressively in the Pacific. And finally, as a result of these first two processes, Japan begins a process of rapid adoption of capitalism and rises to become part of the club of imperialist powers. And Korea is kind of caught between all these different forces that are converging around it. So, starting in the 1860s, Korea begins to be attacked by these various imperialist countries that want to force free trade concessions, like what the British had just won in China.
Mhm.
France takes a turn trying to force Korea open. The US makes a couple of attempts, but eventually it's Japan that succeeds in 1876, and they open Korea to free trade, which really means that they're opening Korea up to capital, and little slices of Korea can now be bought on the free market to the highest bidder.
Wow.
And so, for the next 40 years, these rival imperialist powers are competing for dominance in Korea. And so, by the time that Japan colonizes Korea in 1910, Korea's already endured half a century of imperialist plunder by many powers, including the United States. And every imperialist country got a little piece, a railroad here, a mining concession over there, a port over here. It's a typical story that we've heard before, right? And I think it's important to note this because the US likes to play it off like their role in Korea was always as a friend and as a liberator, when it's always been another colonizer, another wolf in the pack, so to speak.
Yeah.
Now, ultimately, Japan comes out on top, right? And they do this by defeating all their rivals in two wars that are partially fought in Korea itself. So, first, there's the Sino Japanese War of 1895, which ends in the concession of Taiwan to Japan, which is something we're still living with the consequences of today. And then in 1905, there's the Russo Japanese War, a lot of which was again fought in Korea, and the outcome of which also sets the stage for the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the birth of the Soviet Union, another world changing event that we are still living with the consequences of today. Now, after defeating Russia, Japan makes a pact with the US that's known as the Taft Katsura Agreement. And this is where the US pledges to leave Japan alone in Korea as long as Japan respects the United States' colonial claims in the Philippines. So, once again, we see the US historically not being a friend of Korea. And we can also note how these events in Korea are actually shaping the wider trajectory of world history. And so by 1910, Japan is ready to formally annex Korea. Now, at this time, Korea is a feudal society where you had a class of scholar bureaucrats who monopolized land and the offices of the state. And then you had a class of peasants who were the majority. And the peasants produced the wealth and had their harvest taxed by the landlords and by the monarchy. But unlike in European feudalism, feudalism in Korea and a lot of other parts of Asia operated according to communal rights to land, which means that the peasants could not be very easily expelled from that land. Now, Japan's objective in Korea is to extract as much value as possible from this colony in order to fuel its own development. So, the first thing Japan has to do is destroy these communal rights to land. And they do this by imposing capitalist property relations where they didn't previously exist through a land survey. And in the process, they directly take over all of the lands that used to belong to the state, which was the largest landowner. Now, the remaining Korean landowners are bought in as middlemen for this colonial process. And the peasants, the way that this works is that the peasants are doing the harvesting and the planting. They're monitored by Japanese soldiers who are setting the pace for them, telling them what to plant and when. The rice crop is then being collected as a tax, so the peasants are not receiving anything for it in return. The landlords and the colonial government then take that taxed rice and then sell it to Japanese monopolies, who then
Mm.
sell it as a commodity for profit. And because it, and so all the profits are going to the landlords and to the Japanese capitalists, and inevitably the peasantry is driven into deeper poverty, deeper debt, and end up with the situation where Koreans are growing all this rice but can't afford it themselves. Per
Mm.
capita rice consumption fell by about 40% from 1914 to 1929. So Koreans are eating 40% less rice, while at the same time their Japanese counterparts are eating about 3 times as much rice as they do.
Mm.
And ultimately, peasants are being expelled from the land in greater and greater numbers and left with no choice but to survive as workers or as proletarians, people who don't own means of production and have to sell their labor power in order to live. And that's where Japanese capitalism is able to kind of benefit a second time because they've exploited the peasants through taxes. And once the peasants lose their land, the capitalists can benefit again by exploiting these former peasants as workers. Now, unlike in a lot of the colonial world, Japan actually had a vested interest in developing industry in Korea. And there's a couple of reasons for this. First of all, capitalism has this tendency for the rate of the profit to fall. And so industries become less profitable in one place, so they need to move somewhere else where the labor and the land and other things are cheaper. Now, Korea provided that outlet for Japan. And secondly, while Japan was an imperialist power, it wasn't as advanced of an imperialist power as, say, Britain. It needed to expand very quickly in order for capitalism to develop further. And Korea was supposed to kind of be its appetizer to prepare for the main course, which is conquering China and the rest of Asia.
Mm.
And in order to do that, Korea has to have railways to transport troops. It needs industry so Japan can keep cheaply produce what's needed to fight all these wars. And most of all, it needs a pliant, oppressed population that could be readily called upon as cannon fodder and as workers. Now, Koreans had other plans, but we can get into that a little bit later.
Yeah.
Um, so I realize I dropped a lot of information right there. So
No,
if it's appropriate to
that
pause or keep going.
no, please keep that. That's actually fantastic. I think a lot of this is like a nice like history lesson that people are not aware of. And I'm wondering, like, it makes sense given everything you're saying that there would be space for some sort of revolutionary um spirit
Hmm.
given what's taking place. I'm assuming that on some level that is what contributed to communism in Korea eventually arising at some point. I don't know if it's a good idea to talk a little bit about maybe the World War II era before
Hmm.
before we have the Korean War to kind of build into that. But I think when it comes to the Korean War, I'm thinking about it from like your typical American perspective and even American leftists. Um, the Korean War is not understood the way the Vietnam War is. It's kind of papered
Yeah.
over in the way we talk about it and learn about it in the United States. Um, and so I think it's like, can you like set the stage for that? How do we go from what you're talking about to then in the 1950s, you have this war where the US is literally involved in like destroying most of North Korea and splitting the country into two?
So I think those are really astute observations. And what we need to understand about the colonial period is that throughout that entire time, Koreans are fighting this protracted war of national liberation that's taking place on many fronts within Korea itself, within Japan, where there are millions of Korean workers, and also in China as part of the Chinese Revolution, and even in the Soviet Union at certain points as well. So I think that's all context that needs to be taken into account when we try to think about the origins of the Korean War. Because while the vast majority of Korean people are being exploited by Japanese colonialism, excuse me, there is also a tiny class of collaborators. These are the landlords. These are the capitalists who are allowed to own, some enterprises, and these are the people who collaborate with the colonial government, either as high-ranking bureaucrats or as members of the police, which, there had to be a very large police force in Korea. And all those cops couldn't be Japanese because that just wasn't going to be possible. And so these class distinctions, these divisions that are arising during colonialism are going to inform the conflict to come. And I think we need to also understand that as Japan's process of waging war across Asia rages on, the toll is really being felt by Korean people, and there's a very intense bitterness that is being built up that's going to come out, in the post World War II period. To give some sense of what we're talking about, in the 30s and 40s, while Japan is committing atrocities like the Nanjing massacre in China, in Korea they're taking this really big push to essentially erase Korean identity because the resistance is becoming too fierce and they want to crush it and make sure that it's not going to stand in their way. So they take measures like banning the Korean language, forcing Koreans to adopt Japanese names, banning all religious expressions that are not Shintoism, and they also increasingly turned to Korea to answer their labor problems. About 5 million Korean workers were forcibly conscripted to work in Japan or in its other colonies during World War II. And that includes 200,000 women who were made into comfort women who it's been
Mhm.
recognized by many scholars, were basically sex slaves for the Japanese military. And, this is really one of the most horrific crimes of the 20th century. I think there's really no way of, softening the reality of what this was. And this is also a case where survivors are continuing to fight for justice for not only this, but many of the other crimes that were committed by Japanese colonialism during World War II. And that's still relevant to the politics between Korea and Japan. Now, prior to the 19th century, there wasn't really a Korean diaspora, but by 1945, you have 1 in 7 Koreans living overseas, usually in Japan or in Manchuria, either as conscripted labor or so-called free migrants. But of course, we know that they're leaving their land because they've been expelled from it, because they've been forced into debt in order to produce rice, for this empire that has no interest in their own well-being, only in the profit of their own capitalists. Um, and so I think that's the background to the resistance that formed among Koreans. And I think it's important to understand that this was a very factionalized resistance according to ideology, according to class lines, also according to places where people ended up because so many people had to flee. But I would really argue that the bulk of the resistance and the most important wing of the resistance was communist. And that took many different expressions, whether that was Koreans who struggled in the Russian Revolution, who were some of the first communists. The person usually recognized as the first Korean communist, by the way, is a woman named Alexandra Kim. I would encourage people to look her up. Um, it includes Koreans who fought alongside the Chinese Revolution, either in Yan'an or as part of the Northeast Anti-Japanese United Army in Manchuria. This is where Kim Il-sung got his start. And, it's kind of recognized by most historians, including outside the DPRK, that, this is a historical fact. He was a division commander in this army. And by 1940, he was the only commander left.
Mhm.
And that was when he made a decision to strategically retreat into the Soviet Union. And so I think that history is also really important to understand if we want to understand Kim Il Sung and the role that he played in the coming Korean War. Essentially, World War II ends, Japan is defeated, and there's really no plan for Korea. Um, FDR had an idea for trusteeship that he tried to raise a couple times. It was never confirmed. He ultimately dies. And then Truman is left in this position where he's kind of caught with his pants down because the Red Army is barreling across Manchuria into Korea. The Cold War has basically already started, and Truman does not want to be blamed for losing Korea, right? So the Department of Defense rushes to basically draw a quick line across Korea and declare that there's going to be 2 occupation zones. And I think it's important to note the details of this history because the way it gets glossed over is that, oh, the US and the Soviets made a decision to divide Korea, when really it was a US decision. They announced it. The Soviets did not really push back, which, I guess you can give them a little bit of flack for. I think that's warranted. But then that also doesn't mean that it's a decision that's being made bilaterally. One party's making the decision, the other party's going along with it, right?
Mhm.
And in all of this, no one is asking Korean people what we want.
Right.
Um, yeah. So, and meanwhile, from the Korean point of view, we just gotten our independence back, and we were acting like it. People are organizing, whether that's to keep order in their communities or take back the land that the Japanese and collaborators stole from them. There's a committee for the preparation of Korean independence formed, and the call is to put out to organize people's committees, self-governing bodies across the peninsula. And on September 6th, about 3 weeks after Japan's surrender, the People's Committees declare the formation of a state. They declare the Korean People's Republic. And this is a moment where you have a very broad based unity from across ideology, from across the different factions that existed. Um, because there's actually a real basis for it in the class structure of Korean society at this time. It's still a 80 to 90% peasant society where the rest are mostly workers, and there's only a few people who really benefited from colonialism. So the vast majority will benefit from independence and from decolonization, which I'm not using in a woo-woo kind of way. I mean like taking back state power, taking back the land, seizing the means of production, right? Not decolonizing your syllabus or whatever people are talking about these days. So September 6th, there's an independent Korean government declared, but 3 days later, the US military arrives and says, no, we're the government. And so the US military government doesn't want this agenda of decolonization because to them it smells a little too close to communism. And that's the thing they absolutely want to prevent. And in order to stop that, they ally with the only two forces that would want the same thing, who are the landlords and the
Hmm.
bureaucrats and police who serve Japan. So all the traitors who are still left in Korea. Um, and these same collaborators as before, who are brought back into the government. And so Koreans in the South end up in this situation where for like a month they were like, yeah, we're free. And then all of a sudden, the same cops that were kicking the shit out of them a month ago are like back and they're like, no, we're back in charge. And you're independent now. This is an independent country where the same people rule you as a month ago.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and so the US starts to wage a war against the people's committees, the trade unions, and really any element that's going to stand for a united and independent Korea. And the results are catastrophic. There are
Mm.
three major uprisings in South Korea before 1950, the official start of the Korean War. The first one begins in the midst of a famine as a general strike that then turns into like a national wave of essentially uprisings and riots after police kill a lot of the strikers. And then there are two other uprisings in 1948 that are caused by widespread election, actually, that's been engineered by the United States through the UN in order to establish a so called independent Korean government. But the problem with this election is that only Korean property owners in the South get to vote, for one. Um, and two, it's supposed to apply to the entire peninsula, but only half the peninsula is voting. So no Koreans actually want it because they immediately recognize that it's going to cement the division of the country. And almost every political party boycotts the election, including the right wing ones, except for the US's handpicked candidate, Lee Seung-man or Syngman Rhee, as he's known in his kind of a romanized version of his name. And the bigger rebellion that begins is as a guerrilla uprising on Jeju Island, where over the next couple of years, the South Korean army, police, and fascist gangs essentially massacre between 30,000 and 60,000 people.
Ooh.
Over half of the island's villages are burned, and all the while, the US is not only informed of the situation, but they are materially supporting the repression and even advising and commanding the crackdown, because this is happening during the transition to a new government that's going to be known as the Republic of Korea, but the US military is still present.
Mm.
And the massacre in Jeju spawns a mutiny on the peninsula in the cities of Yosu and Suncheon, which is also put down violently, but not before some soldiers escape and begin a guerrilla war in the south. So it's 1948, and essentially a war has already begun in Korea. I think that's the thing that really needs to be stressed. There is massive resistance coming from the South, and it's really along these cleavages that were developed during colonialism between the collaborators and essentially the patriots, right? Between the masses of exploited and working people and the tiny class of parasites who, are living off of their labor. And in all this time, things are going very differently in the North because in the North, the people's committees are not disbanded. They're actually acting as the basis for a new government. After 6 months, there's a central body known as the Provisional People's Committee that's formed, which is headed by Kim Il Sung. And Kim Il Sung at this time not only has the backing of the Manchurian veterans, but he does have, this essential Soviet relationship.
Right.
And I think, those are important factors as to why, he ended up at the head of this new kind of nascent government that's forming in the North. Another factor is that a lot of the other big communists went to the South because they thought like, oh, we're going to be one country, so we have to go to the capital, right, to organize this new national government. And so once the division starts to become more permanent, then there's no way to really have like a truly coordinated effort, right?
Yeah.
Um, and while all these massacres are happening in the South, in the North, the opposite is happening. They're doing land reform. In about 25 days, they redistributed over 2 million acres of land to 700,000 peasant families. And it's the people's committees that are doing this. It's not the Soviets who are like puppeteering Kim Il Sung, who is like, enacting mind control over the people.
Right.
It's the masses of people in their own organizations who are making this happen,
Yeah.
right? And that's followed by like the first gender equality laws in Korea's history. Things like banning child marriage and prostitution, seizing the property of the former colonial government to turn into schools, into daycares, into community centers, a mass literacy campaign because 80% of the people haven't been to school and 90% of women in particular are totally illiterate. All the industry that was used to belong to the Japanese capitalists is being nationalized. And so I think we need to understand that like there's a revolution from the bottom up happening in North Korea,
I think it's
during
such a I also just want to point out, I want you to keep going because we're now essentially getting into the the what we consider in the United States the Korean War, right? But it's such the
Hmm.
stark difference that you just described is literally just capitalism being imposed on the South and then socialism growing in the North. Like that's what you just described, and the differences are so stark. And it's like all of those things you just mentioned, the like basically like the literacy rates going up. I'm sure at some point the mortality rates are going up. All the things that we see when we look at any country that ends up having any socialist revolution, like you see the same things happening in Cuba when their
Hmm.
revolution takes hold, in other countries, in Venezuela after the Bolivarian Revolution, in Vietnam, of course, there was a drastic difference between North and South and how they were dealing with the country. So we don't learn about that. We never learn about that in the U.S. What we learn in the U.S., and then I'll let you take it from there, is that the North, the army in the North, the North Korean People's Army, it invaded the South, and that's how
Hmm.
the war started. The bad guys in the North that were friends with the Soviets invaded the nice, good South, and then the U.S. had to help.
Yes, exactly.
I'll let you tell us what really happened.
Oh yeah, and I'm really glad you brought that element in because I think it's really important to set the record straight, and it's important to also point out like the serious flaws in that narrative. First of all, uh, you know, the 38th parallel was not a peaceful place before 1950. There were a lot of border skirmishes that were happening in 1949, in the spring of 1950, before, the war officially starts. And that includes incursions made from both sides, like I don't think it's like something that you can paint black and white as like like, oh, it was only this side that was aggressing the entire time. There was definitely contestation happening between these two armed forces because the U.S. has essentially created an army in the South. That was one of the first things they did. They got all the old Korean military officers for the Japanese Imperial Army, and they gave them extra training, and were like, all right, start organizing an army of your own, right? And so they've been militarizing, Southern Korea this entire time, and that's all starting to come to a head in these border skirmishes leading up to 1950. The other thing about this narrative of the North invaded the South is that the 38th parallel was not an international border. At this point, you have these two different states, these two different governments who both claim sovereignty over all of Korea. And so that's actually from the standpoint of like the way you would assess that kind of conflict in any other country, that's a civil war. This is a country that's been united for over 1,000 years in its history. And now there are essentially two factions within it that are vying for power. And so if one faction attacks another, you can't say that they invaded the other faction because you can't invade yourself.
Right.
Um, and I think that the way that the US tells the story really naturalizes the division of Korea, really makes it seem as if like, oh well, there's always been two Koreas, or there always should have been two Koreas, right? And if that's the case, then we can label the so-called start of the Korean War in the summer of 1950 as like an act of international aggression, which the U.S. did, and then brought that to the UN in order to authorize this process of intervention that they undertook. Um, and that brings us to the war itself. And I think if there's anything to emphasize in the war itself, it's really that the scale of destruction and the role of the United States in the horror that was unleashed upon the Korean people is something that has been totally erased. There's three phases to the war, and in all of those phases, we see this again and again. The first phase is DPRK troops are moving south and pushing to Busan. What we know now is that the United States ordered its troops to fire on civilians and refugees and treat them as enemy combatants. There were bridges in Seoul that were detonated as people were fleeing the first Battle of Seoul with people on the bridge. There were incidents that are now famous, like the Nogunri massacre, where US soldiers pinned down villagers into a railway tunnel and basically massacred them over a series of days. And this is really emblematic of what they were doing throughout the South. There's testimony that we now have from the U.S. ambassador to South Korea at the time, from officials in the Air Force and in other wings of the armed forces, who basically are saying like, yeah, no, we were given orders to fire on civilians and to essentially treat them as enemy combatants because. And they would repeat this in Vietnam, right? And they had already done this during the Indian Wars in the United States, or in Turtle Island, and their logic was like, well, we can't tell these people apart, so you don't really know who's your enemy. All the people are your enemy then. And At the same time, Syngman Rhee is liquidating all his political enemies. He's forced about 100,000 to 200,000 people to register as dissidents in need of purification. And these people are exterminated virtually overnight. And in a lot of cases, the massacres are then blamed on the DPRK. The biggest incident was the Daejeon massacre, where about 7,000 prisoners were killed and buried in a mass grave as US officers watched. And the Joint Chiefs of Staff actually had photos about this incident. They had reports and they sealed all that information until 1999. And the entire time, the official story the US told was that this is what the North Koreans did. Um, so that's the first phase of the war. Now, the second phase of the war is when the US or UN forces begin to march north. And I want to point out that, if the DPRK invaded the South by crossing the 38th parallel, then as soon as UN forces go north of that parallel, they're doing the same thing. And that's just kind
Mhm.
of like not questioned when we talk about this war. Um, and the way it's narrated is also they make it sound as if the U.S. was about to win because they did actually approach the border with China pretty quickly, but that's where the U.S. doesn't understand the strategic rationale of the North Korean side because from their perspective, they're fighting like guerrilla fighters. You hit hard when you can, when you have the element of surprise, and when your enemy consolidates, that's when you retreat until they are spread thin again. And that's what they were doing. They were drawing the U.S. forces into their own territory, and all the time preparing to surround and enclose them. And so by going north, the US essentially did what the DPRK wanted from a military standpoint. But that doesn't mean that they're not enacting horror upon the people as they're marching north. And particularly the South Korean army and the police are the ones who are, doing a lot of the heavy lifting. They're being given orders to essentially shoot any member of the Korean Workers' Party, which at this point is like 7% of the population. So everyone knows a member of the party, and anyone who's affiliated with a member of the party is being treated as a collaborator. So that's essentially the entire civilian population of the North. And at the same time, the US is unleashing its bombing campaign. And over the next 2 years, it's going to drop more bombs on Northern Korea than it did over the entire Pacific in World War II. And by the end of it, 18 out of 22 of the cities in Northern Korea are more than 50% destroyed, and a couple of them are completely obliterated. It's to the point where just a year after the bombing campaign begins, the Air Force pilots are saying that they have no more targets to hit. So and they're being ordered to just drop bombs anyway. So they're dropping them on random places, on villages, on hospitals, on schools, all kinds of things. And a lot of DPRK facilities are actually forced to operate underground, which speaking of Vietnam, is going to come around to bite America in the ass because all of that expertise is then going to be transferred over to the Vietnamese forces. Um, and as bad as this bombing was, it actually could have been worse. MacArthur had a plan to drop between 10 to 20 nuclear bombs on Korea and China, and then sow a belt of radioactive cobalt across the border so that nothing could grow there and no one could live there for generations. It's like cartoon villain levels of just diabolical scheming that he has. And he was not able to implement this plan, but there were nuclear capable bombers that were deployed to Okinawa, and a number of test runs that were made where US planes would drop dummy A bombs. And you can imagine the horror of like the DPRK commanders watching these planes essentially make the same maneuvers that were made over Hiroshima. And we also know that at this time the Joint Chiefs approved the use of nuclear weapons, and both Truman and Eisenhower essentially went to the press and said that they would go nuclear unless the conflict ended in a way that they would like. And that brings us to the final stage of the war, which is the stalemate, right? So
Mhm.
the Chinese forces intervene. The U.S. forces are caught between like the hammer of China's army and the anvil of the waiting DPRK troops. And this entire time the bombing campaign is continuing, and the US is looking for a way to stop the fighting because they realize they can't achieve total victory. And that's when they start to make these nuclear threats, right? They don't follow through on the nuclear threats, but what they do follow through on is destroying the DPRK's dams. They destroy these four major agricultural dams that supply something like two-thirds of the irrigation for all the farming. Um, and that's really what forces the armistice to like come to a head because they've made it so that um, it's been established for a long time that the US cannot like properly win this war, but they've also made it so that if the DPRK continues, then they're going to have to fend off famine and also fend off win this war at the same time. And so that's what really kind of settles things and allows for the armistice process to sort of finalize. And I think what's important to note is that it's really the brutality, it's the inhumanity of the U.S. military campaign that is forcing this to a head. I think that if it were up to either Korean leader, they would have fought this out to the bitter end. They would not have allowed this position of division to continue because that's not really what either side wanted. They wanted unification, they just wanted it on different terms. And that depended very much on their class orientation and their ideological orientation. Let me pause there for a second.
Well, no, I mean, I think that's all super important to like understand. I actually, before I get to what I wanted to ask you about next, and I think you seem like you wanted to add a little bit more to what you were saying. I just want to note, you were talking about some of like the atrocities that were committed, which are horrible, and just on a more general note, I mean, there's something like 3 million people who were killed in this war. And I'm not sure where that estimate actually comes from and if it might have been more, because I feel like other times I've seen something like maybe 3 to 5 million people. Um, and that was actually like 10% of the Korean population if it was just 3 million. And I think it's so interesting. This isn't even something that anybody tries to hide, is that the rate of civilian casualties was higher than in World War II and the Vietnam War, which is essentially
Mm-hmm.
what you're alluding to. Like the level of atrocities committed, the number of cities and infrastructure that were completely destroyed is so utterly shocking. Obviously, the South suffered too, but a lot of that, like you mentioned, was targeted towards the North by the United States and its Southern allies. Um, but I think what's interesting that happens next, and if there's anything you want to fill in here that I'm like completely moving past too quickly, I just think it's interesting that despite all of that destruction, North Korea, which had ended up establishing the socialist state, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
managed to end up having in the late 50s, throughout the 60s and 70s, an actual higher standard of living than South Korea, which was suffering a ton at the time. So I'm just curious if there's anything else you want to add about the war, please do. But what happens after, and how does North Korea manage to rebuild after all of this destruction?
Yeah, I think the aspect of the DPRK having a higher standard of living than the South for a very long time is something that people either completely don't know or tend to gloss over today. Um, and the explanation that's often kind of fed to people is like, oh well, it was all the Soviets and the Chinese. The North Koreans didn't do anything themselves. They were like, I don't know, they were like kicking back or something. Like they were Soviets doing everything for them, which is definitely not true. And if you actually compare the levels of aid that were received, by the two Koreas from I guess you can call them their respective sponsors, the South received way more aid than the North ever did.
Mhm.
And actually, there were times pretty shortly after the war where the North had a kind of chilly relationship with the other socialist powers, and wasn't really able to rely on them very much for aid, actually. And what that so the deeper story here is a story of, I think, Korean resilience and also the ability of socialism to actually advance human development. Um, so I think that's the thing that's really key here to understand. Um, and so I'm really excited to kind of talk a little bit about the process of how the planned economy of the DPRK after 1953 really helped to rebuild the country. Um, I guess do you have anything like specific that you
Well,
would want to?
actually, the other thing too, I guess that should not go without forgetting before we even get to that, because I know there's a lot of really interesting agricultural policies that were put into
Mhm,
place, and then of course North Korea was being so isolated. It had a couple countries, obviously, like to depend on to some degree, but like you just mentioned, it was more isolated than other socialist states were, and so had like less to rely on. But when we're talking about the end of the war, I mean, then you have it's not really the end, right? Technically, North and South Korea are like still at war
mhm.
in the technical sense. But the U.S. ends up staying in the country and basically administering the dividing line that remains in
Yes.
place.
Mhm,
So in the North, you have the socialist century planned economy that's helping rebuild the country despite obviously a lot of hurdles and obstacles, leading to a higher standard of living, and also that managing to like feed people, right? Because
mhm.
that's really difficult to do when everything's been destroyed. You mentioned dams being destroyed, and that ends up uh, doing a lot of damage to like irrigation and the ability to actually grow food. So maybe that's a specific thing that you could talk about for what the North did. And then also, I'm curious, like after this is happening, the U.S. is basically an occupying force at this point. making
Hmm.
sure that this place stays divided, what's going on in South Korea? And why does South Korea have so much political chaos and instability throughout these years?
Yeah. Um, I guess to kind of speak to the U.S., the continuing U.S. role, the conditions of the armistice in 1953 were actually that all foreign troops were supposed to withdraw within a few months, and that was supposed to set the stage for final peace talks. That did not happen. China fully withdrew. They did that pretty fast. But the US signed a mutual defense treaty with South Korea that created a new legal basis for them to remain in the country. So, I think it's interesting to look at how, this document can in many ways be interpreted as actually violating the armistice itself. Um, in terms of the US role in the South, you have Syngman Rhee, who remains the president until 1960. I think South Korean leaders are often rightfully kind of just, decried as, U.S. puppets, and I think that's very true to a degree. But I think it's also important to understand that they are representing their own class interests as well, which are not necessarily going to be 100% aligned with U.S. class interests at all times. And the U.S. is pumping aid into South Korea throughout this period, but the Syngman Rhee government is essentially too kleptocratic and inept to actually wield that aid very well. It's not translating into actual development in Southern Korea for a very long time. It's mostly just kind of being ferreted away and stolen. And you actually have this huge black market economy that's developing at the same time. And what that means for most people is that, there are some investments being made in education and things like that, which are going to enable capitalist development later. But for the most part, what people are looking at is continued semi-feudal economy or just like lumpenization, being unemployed or semi-employed, particularly for masses of young people. And, in 1960, there's a revolution that overthrows Syngman Rhee. Um, but that's quickly aborted when there's a military coup led by Pak Jung-hee, who was actually a former officer for the Japanese Imperial Army. And Pak Jung-hee models a lot of South Korea's future development from Japan's state capitalism during the period of World War II and prior. So he's essentially recreating the conditions of colonialism, but in a very different way. Um, and a lot of what he does is maneuver in the Cold War setting to, like send Korean troops to Vietnam in exchange for, loans and aid and investments from the United States. And he's able to leverage this to very rapidly develop South Korean industry. But of course, in a way that depends on the brutal and totalizing exploitation of workers in South Korea. So I think that's a very like general sense of what's going on in South Korea during this time, and I think it's important to note that the left in South Korea was liquidated during the Korean War, right? They were essentially totally exterminated, and so it took another generation for a new workers' movement to develop, for a new democratic movement to develop, and that's also a big part of why the history is what it looks like today, because in the South they basically had carte blanche to more or less do whatever they wanted.
And then you have the North becoming obviously rebuilding and like
Hmm.
the sort of like and I I've heard people. I'm personally not like an expert in agriculture, but I have heard some academics talk about like really impressive things that the North Koreans did, and also just the ability to like build and plan these like these major cities that look quite good today. And it's a pretty modern society as far as it can be. But we are fed a very different narrative about North Korea here in the United States. And I just want to give one of the most extreme examples as of late that just keep, showing up in my Twitter feed. And that is, for example, I'm sure you're familiar with her, this woman, this exile woman called, is it, how do you say her name? Yeomni? I,
Yeonmi.
Yeonmi. Okay, Yeomni
Mhm.
Park. No relation to you,
No,
I assume.
no, very common last name.
Very common last name. But here she is. Um, here she is on Joe Rogan, and I'm sorry for the quality of this clip, but for those who are just listening and don't see, this is like her basically sitting at the microphone on Joe Rogan, and this is one of the more ridiculous things she said that got quite a bit of attention. So I'm going to go ahead and play it.
One distance like a once a month and like here it would take like 1 hour to go to the other place. In North, it take a month at least to go because there's no electricity, and sometimes people have to push the train.
They have to push the train.
Yeah, traveling in North Korea.
So that's a little bit of an edited one. That's why you hear those sound effects. But yeah, this like really went viral because she was, and then people started like sending memes of her pushing trains or of people pushing
Mhm.
trains, being like, "This is what it's like in North Korea." Here's another thing she said recently. This is on a different program. She's talking about what it's like to get a driver's license in North Korea and what's required.
In our country, in North Korea, if you want to get a driver license, very vigorous process. You have to go to basic driving school entire year. And the end of that school, you need to know how to deassemble the car and then reassemble the whole thing back together. You really have to know the engine, assembly, entire mechanics of car. Then they're gonna give you the driver license. In our country, North.
So that was like kind of just a funny one. It's not as crazy. Here's
Mhm.
one more I'll show that she said more recently as well about something that apparently can get you executed in North Korea.
Will get executed because in North Korea, every classroom, every room have the portraits of dictators: Kim Il Sung, Kim Jong Il, Kim Jong Un, and their wife. In the middle of the night, the officers will kick your door and come, and with a cloth and wipe the portrait. There's a tiny bit dust gathered on that portrait. That's how you end up getting executed because your royalty was not good enough. And when you end up in a concentration camp, the first thing that you cannot do is why you are there. If you are asking them why did I end up in a concentration camp, they execute you on the spot. And now with Kim Jong Un, he decided that even bullets are too precious for the people of North Korea. He using this method of hotboxing. In a metal box, put a human being in there and let them drain to death. That's how he kills people now in the 21st century.
I mean, to be honest, like if that really was the case, if that's how he was killing people, it just seems like it wouldn't be very effective. I'm just saying, it seems like it would take more resources to put somebody in a metal box. There was actually another clip, unfortunately, I could not find. I was kind of upset I couldn't because, and I'm
Mhm.
sure you've seen it. It's this one where it's also from Joe Rogan, and she's talking about how like everyone in North Korea is just like starving, and children, they're so hungry that their stomachs explode, and then they're just like alive with exploded stomachs, like laying down in the road, and then dogs come and eat their stomachs while they're still alive. And then Joe Rogan's just like repeating what she says without question. He's like, wow, with their stomachs hanging out? It's just like, it's like that doesn't happen. I don't even know. Anyways, this is, and you know, I know those examples sound like ridiculous, but this woman is
Mhm.
actually taken very seriously. She is like
Yeah.
on, I mean, those were not like marginal places that I just showed. Like Joe Rogan's the most popular podcast like in the world, the most downloaded podcast in the world. She was also on this other comedy show. She also goes on mainstream media. She's always being hosted by all of these sort of like Ned funded things to come speak. And she's just like one of a whole network of people who just say the most outlandish things about North Korea. So I guess my question for you is, I mean, obviously we don't have enough time to sit here and talk about exactly what North Korea is actually like. But is it true that you have to push trains? One
Um,
train.
I'm pretty
One
I'm
train.
pretty sure it's not. I don't think that's possible. Trains are very heavy.
Like what's your reaction to that sort of thing as like, you know, a Korean yourself who's, I mean, it
Mhm.
must be so frustrating first of all to see that sort of thing cuz you're basically always work you want these, you want to, you know, you want reunification, you want the liberation of Korea, and then you're up against this whole crazy network of whatever that was. Like,
Yeah.
what's your
Mhm.
response to all that?
Well, I think it's important to emphasize that, it is this like really crazy network.
If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear the rest, you can access it by becoming a Breakthrough News member at patreon.com/breakthrough news.